Desperate times call for desperate measures, and we are witnessing both today from Donald Trump. Desperate times for a politically emasculated president reduced to lying about his poll numbers, firing the pollsters who conducted polls that show him trailing Joe Biden by double digits, calling the newspaper that reported on his own administration's cyber war against Russia, quote, treasonous, and denying the story, a possible indication of his ongoing fear of angering Vladimir Putin. The Washington Post details the president's political desperation, writing this, quote, slumping in the polls and at war with his political rivals, President Trump has signaled a willingness to act with impunity in his drive for re-election. Taken together, Trump's recent actions set off new alarm bells among legal analysts and Trump's political rivals, who warn that the president and his aides have emerged from the scorched earth battle over the special counsel's 22-month investigation into Russian interference in the 2016 election with a conviction that they need not feel constrained by the safeguards built into the nation's political system as they look to 2020. And if we are watching a president who is unconstrained by norms, then a blockbuster report from the New York Times should cause even more alarm. The reporting we're about to share with you earned the paper an accusation of committing treason from Donald Trump for publishing a story that would count as good news for any normal White House. It's about America, the good guys, strengthening our cyber offense against Russia. These days, the bad guys. Here's some of that story. Quote, the U.S. is stepping up digital incursions into Russia's electric power grid in a warning to President Vladimir Putin. But the story adds, quote, Pentagon and Intel officials describe broad hesitation to go into detail with Trump about operations against Russia for concern over his reaction and the possibility that he might countermand it or discuss it with foreign officials, as he did in 2017, when he mentioned a sensitive operation in Syria to the Russian foreign minister. And the aforementioned attack from the president for reporting that the U.S. is on offense against Russia. He wrote this, quote, this is a virtual act of treason by a once great paper. So desperate for a story, any story, even if bad for our country. Also, not true. Now, anyone trained in pattern recognition can see something pretty obvious from this president. Donald Trump is gleeful to be on offense against longtime U.S. allies, the FBI, DOJ, Congress, the island of Puerto Rico, Democrats, Republicans, actors, singers, the cast of Hamilton, the New York Times, CNN, really anyone except Russia.
Russia, if you're listening, I hope you're able to find the 30,000 emails that are missing.
I believe that President Putin really feels, and he feels strongly, that he did not meddle in our election.
I have great confidence in my intelligence people, but I will tell you that President Putin was extremely strong and powerful in his denial today.
This is somebody that said, we have information on your opponent. Oh, let me call the FBI. Give me a break. Life doesn't work that way.
The FBI director says that's what should happen.
The FBI director is wrong.
And that is where we start today with some of our favorite reporters and friends. From Birmingham, former U.S. Attorney Joyce Vance. With us on set, John Heilman, NBC and MSNBC national affairs analyst. Ben Rhodes, former Deputy National Security Advisor for President Obama and politics editor for the Daily Beast. Sam Stein. Ben Rhodes. I don't know what to say anymore. I mean, that's why we just show the tape and show the reporting. It all speaks for itself. The up is down, down is up, good is bad, bad is good, and it's never Russia's fault, even when his own government is trying to protect us from Russia.
Yeah, and first of all, it's not uncommon that you would want to at least have the capability to have a cyber offensive option. Let me tell you, Russia certainly does, right? And the fact that Donald Trump is impediment to his own government doing what's in the national security interest of the United States, I can assure you that Vladimir Putin shows no such reservation about attacking our democracy, about probing our power grid. So you have someone, once again, in Donald Trump, who's putting his own political interest ahead of the country's. And really, Nicole, this is part of a pattern where you've seen him also not just send dog whistles, but invite Russia back into our election in 2020 on his behalf to say that there's nothing wrong with accepting that kind of help, right? And so we should really be worried here that we have someone who is in charge of our government who doesn't see that government as serving the interests of the American people, defending our democracy, but rather he's focused on just what can he do for his own political interest. And if he has to toss aside norms, if he has to toss aside our own security, if he has to throw his own intelligence community under the bus, that's something he'll do. And to call this treasonous and then say it's not true, it can't be both, right? And the reality, if there's something to the story that he thinks is treasonous, then by definition it's true. And in that reporting, it suggested they went to the National Security Council for comment. They did not refute the story. They did not say that this is against our national security interests. So his own administration doesn't agree with these tweets.
So let's unpack some of that, because you and I have worked inside the government when news outlets like the New York Times have called with scoops like this. And in our instance, it was a lot of the counter-terror programs put in place after 9/11. The New York Times came to us when they learned about the metadata program. And we didn't want that in the newspaper. We thought it would take away a program. We thought it would tell the terrorists one of the ways that we were tracking them through their phone records. And that paragraph in that story gave me chills.
Yeah.
They put in, usually you just learn that. If you're the New York Times, the Daily Beast, usually you just get that piece of information and you have more confidence publishing it. That they put that paragraph in the story, the significance of putting in the newspaper, we called to make sure that by publishing a cyber program that the Pentagon was putting in place as an offensive measure against Russia, we were not jeopardizing national security, and we were told we were not. To put that in the paper, to me, just reeked of very high-level confirmation of that account.
Yeah, I've been on the other end of that phone
Me too.
call, including from some of those New York Times reporters
Me too.
who were on that story,
Singer.
including on cyber stories. And I've had to sit down with them and say,
Me too.
this is something that could compromise if it actually comes out in the paper.
And I always lost. I hope you fared better than me.
I get a half a loaf, right? And the fact that they got no response signals that there was not a national security concern. And frankly, Nicole, the Russians know that we would be doing this, just like we know that the Russians would be doing this. It is not a surprise to Russia or China or the United States that there might be cyber operations taking place. And it is just so bizarre. Why did he even feel the need to comment on this? Why not just say nothing, right? This is something that...
But isn't the normal response, go team? USA?
The normal response would be what we would say in office, which is, yes, we have certain cyber capabilities, offensive capabilities. We're going to do what's necessary to protect the United States, and we're not going to talk about it. You actually want the Russians to think that there's some capability that we have. What Trump is saying is, Vladimir Putin, don't worry. I'm not going to let this go too far.
I actually have 2 points here, and one of them is a question for Ben. The first is, yes, he didn't have to publicly say it wasn't true. He could have done a private overture to Putin saying, no, this isn't true, even if it was a lie. But the second question, which I'm curious for your thoughts on, was the part of the piece that says essentially that his own staff was keeping him out of the loop on some of this some of these measures. There's an obvious ethical dilemma to not having the commander-in-chief know about these types of programs. And I'm curious what your thoughts are for whether that is a wise move, whether that's the right move, and what that might have suggested about the president's response to this.
Well, I think it speaks to a broader dysfunction in the way in which national security policy is made in this administration. You see this on multiple issues. I mean, you saw a few weeks ago Iran, which is the other big story in the news. We're moving aircraft carriers. We're issuing stern warnings from John Bolton and Mike Pompeo. And then Trump comes out and says, wait a second, we're not trying to start a war here. And I wanted to say, hey, you might want to check with the national security advisor who's down the hall, because he seems to have a plan that you don't know about, right? And so it seems like they take advantage of his there's a combination.
But should they? That's the question, is should he be put in the loop on these things? Isn't it, I mean, ultimately he is the president, right? I'm being serious. Do they need to go around him? Should they, or should they brief him on these?
Look, we're in a democracy. Ultimately, he has to be in the loop on these things. The combination of his disinterest in them, right? So I don't get the sense that he's wanting to dig down in the weeds of what we're doing on cyber or any other issue for that matter. If you combine that with the fact that they might not want him to veto something, they're taking advantage of his general disinterest and disinclination to be on top of what's happening in his own government.
Let me just bring you into this, Heilman, and ask you if we're not talking around something. I mean, they don't tell him about it because I think he's going to call and tell Russia, just like he did in the Oval with Lavrov and Kislyak.
You guys are having. I love you guys, but you guys are having the quaintest, oddest conversation I've ever heard. Ben's over here saying
2012 is calling, and they want their roundtable back.
It's like Ben's over here saying, well, you know, the president, it would be really in a normal White House, the president would just not comment on something like this. It's, first of all,
It's not a normal White House. Second of all, the president comments on everything. Not saying it's good, not saying it's acceptable, but like, what does Trump not comment on? And in what way do we ever, we're so far past applying any kind of a normal framework for evaluating his behavior. And it's the same thing with you. I'm not trying to say you guys aren't wrong. In a normal White House, these comments and questions would be the right questions. In this White House, though, you look at it and say, well, first of all, he comments on everything. And second of all, you're getting to the point where you're asking the real question, which is the national security establishment in a normal democracy with a normal president who had America's best interests at heart, of course, would have a constitutional, democratic, and other responsibility to notify the president. But clearly what's going on is that much of the national security establishment looks at Trump and says he's not fully on board with the objectives that we are pursuing by trying to keep Russia at bay. They think,
do you not see an ethical dilemma?
I see. Okay. Well, no, I see. What I see
what I
see is a huge problem with a president of the United States whose loyalties are in question among his own national security advisors, which is, I think, the real problem. Not that they're doing something unethical, but that they have a president that is so far outside the norms that they have to take.
I'm just playing devil's advocate, but we did not elect these national security officials. We elected a president, right? Should they not be executing his world vision?
Well, I think that they should be, although it's been clear, and I think that for a long time that some of the national security advisors around Trump have looked at him and said, we have to tailor the information we give to him because he doesn't understand the complex information. He doesn't want to read the briefing books. We have to show him pictures. There's a whole bunch of things that we've heard for 2 years where the national security establishment is doing all kinds of things to accommodate for a president who is not like any other president we've ever seen in the office.
Joyce Vance, we're also talking around the truth that Donald Trump's conduct was so suspicious that acting director of the FBI, Andy McCabe, opened a full-field investigation into him to answer the question, is he a Russian agent? So I think this not only is this conversation out of a time capsule, we're also not addressing the central question. And while Robert Mueller didn't prove a criminal conspiracy with Russia, the truth is Donald Trump and everyone around him is leaning into, you want to see collusion, people? 2016 was nothing. Here's what we've got coming in 2020. Watch this, Joyce, and let's talk about it on the other side.
There's nothing wrong with taking information from Russians. There's nothing wrong with taking information. It depends on where it came from. It depends on where it came from.
Quite frankly, the whole thing's just a big distraction for the country. And you look at, what Russia did, buying some Facebook ads to try to sow dissent and do it, and it's a terrible thing. But I think the investigations and all of the speculation that's happened for the last 2 years has had a much harsher impact on our democracy than a couple of Facebook ads.
As a joke that, there was obviously never any help from the Russians.
So, Joyce, they are expert at, if nothing else, moving the goalposts. And it went from, I guess I'm old enough to remember when Donald Trump stood in the East Room and said there was no collusion. I don't even know any Russians. And now everyone from his campaign chairman to his son-in-law to whatever title Rudy holds this week, there's nothing wrong with talking to Russia. And then most recently, Donald Trump with George Stephanopoulos, damn right I'd listen to Russia.
It's a new world, right? Collusion is good. We should all do it. Seems to be the world we're living in this administration now. There's an important point that you make, Nicole, though, and it's that when Andy McCabe opened this investigation, it wasn't just a criminal investigation. It also had a national security component. And what we know is that this entire, counterintelligence question, we don't know what happened to that investigation. Last week, Congressman Schiff said that they were trying to figure out that they hadn't been briefed on the intelligence side of the House. We don't know what conclusions, if any, have led folks in the intelligence community to withhold briefings from the president, if in fact that's true. But you'll remember that in July of 2017, the president issued a statement and said that he had talked with Vladimir Putin, that they would work together on a cyber program to protect elections. Russia was going to make sure our 2020 election was secure. And that in and of itself makes you think that the intelligence community may have to think very carefully about what they disclose to this president, because they know all too well who he's actually talking to.
So, Joyce, I've got two follow-ups for you. One, we've been talking about what a normal national security team does because Ben was part of one and Sam covered one. Here are some headlines from this not normal administration. New York Times, in a push for 2020 election security, I think this is what you're talking about, top official was warned, don't tell Trump. And just last week, after the president's comments to George about whether or not he'd accept dirt from an American adversary about an opponent. Here's what Andy McCabe said about those fresh comments.
I'm quite certain that our counterintelligence professionals in the FBI and in other places are listening to those comments yesterday, and they are very concerned. Very concerned not just about this cavalier attitude that the president has about federal election law. They're also concerned about this invitation effect that his comments may have to those adversaries that are best positioned to take advantage of it. So I am sure those folks are kind of recalibrating their efforts today and figuring out how to get to the bottom of this. I would expect that to be happening.
So, Joyce, my question for you is, what footing is current law enforcement, counter intel, and CIA on right now to protect America from another Russian attack on our elections with this new and fresh body of rhetoric coming from the president, his top defense lawyer in the Russia probe, his campaign chairman, and his son-in-law?
He's certainly made it a lot easier to prove intent if there's a round two on campaign finance violations. You'll recall that Mueller looked at whether or not the president had engaged in that kind of criminal activity and concluded that he couldn't definitively establish that the president had the knowledge and the willfulness necessary. Well, with these comments, the president is saying that in 2020, if he accepts help from a foreign country, he's doing it knowing that the criminal code says it's wrong, but he has somehow supplanted that and decided on his own that it's perfectly legitimate behavior.
So, Ben Rhodes, my question for you is, if insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result, if you look at everything that the U.S. government did when Donald Trump ran for president, I mean, the New York Times reporting about keeping the investigation into the president's campaign confidential, if you pull the string all the way through to the current Attorney General Barr, now trying to rummage through the CIA, to the intel products, to figure out, to investigate not just the investigators, but the intel. Are we insane to expect a different result in 20 than we got in 16?
Yes. There's no question that they're going to try to invite this type of assistance. There is no.
Haven't they already done that in the tape I just played?
They continue to do it, and there's no question that the Russians are going to do this. Why wouldn't they? It worked so well the last time, right? And this is where I think you need to see much more aggressive tactics from other parts of the government. The pieces of the government that should be independent are people in the FBI, people in the Department of Justice. Congress can be playing much more hardball here and say, we're not going to fund the Department of Justice unless we get access to some of these things. We're not going to fund the intelligence community. There's lots of different people who have the power to pull levers other than saying that people who work directly under the president should be insubordinate. I think it's time for those people to step up and recognize that this is not just someone who cozies up to Putin. The only thing he doesn't comment on, John, is any authoritarian. You know, he's not commenting on the pro-democracy protests in Hong Kong. He's not commenting on the pro-democracy protests in Russia that help support journalists.
Why not?
Because his affinity is for these authoritarians. He sees himself as part of that club. He has more in common with Kim Jong-un, Vladimir Putin, and Xi Jinping than he does with the people in his own government and people in the U.S. Congress. And that is what is so chilling.
Let me just say to Ben's point about people stepping up, yes, the unelected bureaucrats in the Intelligence Committee can play a role, obviously.
They've all been fired. I mean, let me defend them for a second.
All of them,
Andy McCabe, Jim Comey, they're all gone. The people that investigated the 16 attack.
But I think the bigger point, one that was missed in the montage early on, was that Congress actually is abdicating a ton of responsibility here. And deliberately so. This past week, a measure was brought to the floor of the Senate for unanimous consent that would require disclosure if you were contacted by a foreign government on your campaign. Marsha Blackburn, Senator of Tennessee, objected to the unanimous consent, likely at the behest of Mitch McConnell, who has held up a ton of election security measures. Okay?
Why?
It's a great question.
He did in 2016 when we asked him to blow the whistle.
There's a history to this. And then, but it gets even weirder than that. This past weekend, a member of the House Intel Committee, Chris Stewart of Utah, Republican, said you'd be foolish. That was a quote, foolish if you did not take the chance to talk to a foreign government offering dirt on your opponent. That's a member of the Intel Committee. So clearly there is an issue with members of Congress buying into the Trump logic that this is just the way the game is played. And Congress, which actually is comprised of elected officials, does actually need to step up here.
Well, and maybe buying into more than the Trump logic. Maybe buying into the same tactics and some of those people. There's been reporting on some of these people who have, connections where they seem to have been doing the same things in their own campaigns that Trump is doing, and they don't just buy the argument, but also are perfectly happy and are themselves now inviting assistance from various foreign sources. And I think, Sam, to your point earlier, which I think is an important point, I do ask, if you work at the FBI, you work in the CIA, you are part of the deep state. I'm putting quotes around that to make fun of it. And you look at the President of the United States and you say, the President of the United States has abdicated his oath of office. He did it just the other day on George Stephanopoulos' interview. Mm-hmm. He's not protecting the national security interests of the United States. He's not committed to protecting our election integrity and security. We can take measures that would achieve that. Are you working for the president or are you working for the United States of America? I think a fair number of those people, their attitude is, I'm working for the United States of America. I'm working for electoral integrity. I'm working for national security. And this president is no longer serving those interests. So I'm going to do what I have to do, not to break laws, but to do what I think is right for the country.
Look at what happened to the last people that did that.
I'm
That's
not
what
saying there's
John
not a risk.
Brennan and Jim Clapper and Jim Comey and Andy McCabe and Jim Baker did. They opened that investigation.
And as you point out, many of them have paid a price for it. But I think there are also, you look around, everything we've seen so far from Christopher Wray suggests that we don't know what he's doing behind the scenes, but at least in terms of his public presentation, he seems to be taking that approach. And I'm sure there is, if you know what, and there are others who know a lot more about the FBI and the CIA than I do, but my impression from reporting and from watching these people over the last few years is that there are a lot of patriots. The patriots, there's a deep bench of patriots in those organizations whose attitude is, if the president's not going to do this work, I guess we're going to have to.
Joyce, let me give you the last word.
I like Heilman's deep bench a lot better than I like the notion of a deep state. And I think it's true. There is a deep bench of professionals. They are in an untenable position trying to decide whether they report up to a president who ultimately may not have the country's best interests at heart. And I think that they will have to try to struggle through in unprecedented waters and hope we can come out on the other side intact.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.